All right, so today we're going to be talking about influenza and the immune system. So for a quick overview, influenza is a viral infection, one of the most commonly known ones today, and it is very contagious. This virus is very important because it affects a staggering 8% of the U.S. population every year. And some of the most common symptoms are fever, chills, cough, sore throat, runny, stuffy nose, body muscle aches, and fatigue. And we'll be looking at the interaction between influenza and the immune system at 3 levels of the whole organism species, tissues, organs, and the cellular level. So influenza is easily spread from person to person through droplets of bodily fluid. And when an infected person coughs or sneezes on a healthy person, they can easily infect them. And influenza attacks the respiratory system, taking a toll on the entire body. Now let's zoom in from the whole organism species to tissues and organs. So when influenza cells infect the body, they will immediately hit the innate immune system, which is composed of leukocytes such as macrophages and neutrophils, which will engulf invading cells and degrade them. These leukocytes will also secrete chemicals called cytokines that will recruit more leukocytes to come to the site to help fight off the invading cells. And another really cool cell of the innate immune system is the dendritic cell. So dendritic cells will also engulf invading cells, but they will actually present their antigens to cells such as T cells, which leads us right into the adaptive immune response, in which information flows from dendritic cells to T cells to B cells and further. So the first step of the adaptive immune response is T cell activation by antigen-presenting cells, such as the dendritic cell that I talked about a moment ago. So like I said, dendritic cells will engulf invading cells such as pathogens like the influenza virus, and it will present MHC2 and MHC1 proteins to T cells, and T cells will bind to specific MHC proteins. So the CD8 T cell binds to the MHC1, and CD4 binds to MHC2. And this is very specific because once stimulated, CD8 T cells will divide into cytotoxic T cells through clonal expansion, and CD4 T cells will divide into helper T cells. And it's important to note that when the cells divide, some of them become plasma cells and some become memory cells in case the same virus infects again. Now, B cells get activated when antigens bind to their B cell receptors, and then they present them with MHC2 proteins to helper T cells, which will come over and bind to that presented antigen on the B cell, and then they will release cytokines that will stimulate the B cell for action. So once the B cells are stimulated, they will then divide into plasma B cells and memory B cells, just as the T cells did before. So now T cells have been activated, B cells have been activated and stimulated. What happens next? So cytotoxic T cells respond to cells infected by influenza by the cell-mediated response, in which the cytotoxic T cells will recognize the antigens on the surface of the infected cells and bind to them. And the T cell will release proteins that induce apoptosis on the infected cell. And through the humoral response, plasma B cells will release antibodies, which are Y-shaped proteins that will mark and tag antigens for destruction, neutralizing them from infecting other cells. And once antigens have been tagged, they can then be engulfed and degraded by leukocytes such as neutrophils. Finally, let's move from the organ tissue level to the cellular level. So on the cellular level, we're going to take a closer look at what exactly happens to healthy cells infected by the influenza virus, how cells present antigens, and the cell-mediated response. So when an influenza cell and a healthy cell come in contact, H proteins on the membrane of the influenza cell bind to receptors on the healthy cell, allowing an entrance into the cell. Now the RNA can enter the cell's nucleus, replicate, and create more influenza cells to go out and infect other cells. Next, for how cells present antigens, we're going to look at dendritic cells. Once the dendritic cell engulfs an influenza cell, is encased in an endosome which binds to the lysosome, which degrades the influenza cell into fragments called epitopes. Then the epitopes bind with MHC proteins, which are presented on the outside of the dendritic cell for cells like T cells. And finally, we have our deeper look into the cell-mediated response. So when cytotoxic T cells bind to infected cells, they secrete proteins called pore-forming proteins and apoptosis-activating proteins. Pore-forming proteins open up pores in the cell membrane by which apoptosis activating proteins can then enter the cell, inducing apoptosis and killing the cell. Then finally, leukocytes such as macrophages or neutrophils will come and finish the job, engulfing the cell fragments. Thank you for watching, and please enjoy my immune system pun.